Welcome to the Creek Road Baptist Pulpit. These weekly podcasts feature expository messages delivered to edify the soul. Now let's join Pastor Dave as he presents this week's message.
Luke 18, beginning in verse 1, the unjust judge or the persistent widow. I'm not sure what to call this parable. Perhaps you can help me decide today. We're going to talk about the unjust judge or the persistent widow. Well, we'll see here in just a minute. Well, let's read, beginning with verse 1, and we'll read through verse 8, I think. Yes, verse 8. And he spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray, and not to faint, saying, There was in a city a judge, which feared not God, neither regarded man. And there was a widow in that city, and she came unto him, saying, Avenge me of mine adversary. And he would not for a while. But afterward he said within himself, Though I fear not God nor regard man, yet because this widow troubleth me, I will avenge her, lest by her continual coming she weary me. And the Lord said, Hear what the unjust judge saith. And shall not God avenge his own elect, which cry day and night unto him, though he bear long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man cometh, shall he find faith on the earth? I don't know if you know him or not. I hope you do. His name is George Mueller. George Mueller lived in the 19th century. He was German, moved to Great Britain, and started an orphanage in Great Britain. And he's been often called the apostle of trust or the apostle of faith, because George Mueller, early on when he was saved, decided that he was going to trust God for everything. And so by consistent devotion of prayer, he asked God for his every need. He didn't take a salary from the church that he pastored. He just allowed the Lord to take care of his needs, and he would lay everything out before his Lord. And over the years, he would see the needs roll in, or the supply roll in. He not only, if you could imagine just trusting the Lord for your salary and not actually having a steady income, but an income that was given to you from the Lord, not only for himself and for his wife and for his children, but he had hundreds upon hundreds of orphans to take care of. And he designed that he would not seek help from them, except that he would resort to the Lord and ask for help. And for his workers and for all their physical needs, the furniture, the houses, the food, the clothing, everything, he put it all out before the Lord. And if you've never read his story, I would encourage you to find any biography of George Mueller and read it. It's very enlightening and challenging. Well, as I have read that story of George Mueller several times, I've actually been going back through it again here recently. I found a quote from Mr. Mueller which fits our passage today. Now, Jesus is saying that men ought always to pray. Notice how we open in the 18th chapter. He spake a parable unto them to this end, that is, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. So the subject of this parable is about prayer and about continuing in prayer. Listen to what George Mueller, the apostle of faith, had to say about that. He said, It is not enough to begin to pray, nor to pray aright. Nor is it enough to continue for a time to pray. But we must patiently, believingly continue in prayer until we obtain an answer. And further, we have not only to continue in prayer unto the end, but we have also to believe that God does hear us and will answer our prayers. Most frequently, we fail in not continuing in prayer until the blessing is obtained, and in not expecting the blessing. That's George Mueller. So, continuing in prayer until the blessing is obtained and expecting a blessing is basically the point of this parable, and it's what Brother Mueller tells us about from his own experience. Notice again the very first verse. He spake a parable unto them to this end, that men ought always to pray and not to faint. I just want to categorize myself as a fainting prayer this morning. I have been, and I'm sure you have too, a fainting prayer. And I won't ask for a raising of hands to identify who the fainting prayers are in here, but I think all of us are fainting prayers. And I think part of it is because of the generation in which we live. We live in what I would like to, for this sermon this morning, I would like to designate our generation and the generations previous to ours and the ones that are coming on after us, the Pop-Tart generation. Because when we wake up in the morning, we go to the cabinet and we pull out that lovely pastry that's covered with that sugary goodness, and we put it in our toaster and we heat it up. Or, if we can't wait for it to be warm, we just eat it straight out of the package because we get instant gratification. We are the Pop-Tart generation. And if we put it in our toaster, we sit there and look at the toaster like the toaster's a broken thing, doing its job of a minute and a half of toasting that toaster pastry in the toaster so that it might be warm and yummy when it pops up out of the toaster. And we sit there tapping our toe wondering, how long do I have to wait for my Pop-Tart? Now, you take that attitude and you apply it to Luke chapter 18, verse 1, men ought always to pray and not to faint. Well, how's the Pop-Tart generation going to do with that? Continuing in prayer until we receive an answer? We hardly can wait a minute and a half for our Pop-Tart to be done. We stick it in the microwave, our bag of popcorn, and it says 2 minutes and 25 seconds. Push the button, and we stand there and we look at it, and we listen to it, and we wonder, how long is this going to take? Well, it's going to take 2 minutes and 25 seconds. That's exactly how long it's going to take. And it seems like an eternity because we're looking at the microwave like it's a strange thing that the microwave is taking 2 minutes and 25 seconds to pop popcorn. You know, like that's a long time or something, right? This is why when we apply our attitude to prayer, we say, well, how come God didn't answer my prayer? I asked Him. Jesus wants to help us with that this morning. And He gives us this parable. First of all, in a city. There was in a city a judge. Look there at verse 2. Which feared not God, neither regarded man. All right, now let's build a profile of this judge. Number one, he didn't fear God. What does that mean? Well, we know that wisdom is the beginning of, or the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. So he doesn't have the wisdom of God, which means he probably doesn't respect God's laws, which probably means he has no regard for any of the commandments. Anything that God has said, he doesn't reverence the Word of God. It has no meaning to him whatsoever. So he has no fear for what God has said. The laws and the judgments which God has delivered, this judge has no care for whatsoever. As a matter of fact, he probably eschews them. He thinks that they're foolish. All right, so that's the beginning. He doesn't fear God. So you can imagine that kind of man. He's a judge, which means he is the one where people come to make right the problems that they have. It's just like we have judges here. We have a case against our neighbor or a case against a corporation or a case against someone. We go to a judge to make right the problem. And if we go, in righteousness, then we hope that we will receive a judgment in righteousness. This judge doesn't know what righteousness means because he doesn't fear God. He has no care for righteousness or holiness. He has no care for the Word of God. He has no care for the law of God. He doesn't even think they're worth his time. That's how foolish this man is. But he's in a position to judge. Second, he doesn't regard man. Now this is noteworthy and wonderful in a way because there's no way that you can bribe this judge. The rich man who walks into his court, he treats like every other man that walks into his court. He doesn't regard the rich. The rich man means nothing to him. The poor man who comes into his court absolutely means nothing to him. All he's going to do is he's going to judge without regard to their status in the community. He's going to judge without regard to their wealth or lack thereof. He's going to judge without regard to any condition that is placed on those people as they come into his court, which is commendable. The widow that comes before him, he doesn't have any regard for her. He has no compassion towards her for her condition. Neither does he have compassion for the beautiful young maiden who walks into his courtroom. He has no compassion on her, and he is not persuaded by her beauty or her grace. This man has no regard for any other man, no matter their condition, no matter their sex, no matter their station in life. He regards no man, which, as I say, is commendable because that's what you want out of a judge, except that for the judges in Israel, they were to give deference to the widow, and they should give compassion to the poor, and especially those who are in a condition like this lady is in today. Okay, so that's our judge, and we'll see a little bit more about him in just a minute. Then in that same city, notice verse 3, there is a widow, and there was a widow in that city, and she came unto him, saying, Avenge me of mine adversary. Now, all we know about this widow is she's a widow. She doesn't have a husband. Her husband has passed. She lives alone. Maybe her children are not with her. Maybe her children live away from her. And so she's all alone. And as you can imagine, this lady's probably older, and she has been preyed upon by someone. And does that still happen today? Absolutely. There are criminals in our world that prey on the elderly, and especially those who are left alone. And so this woman comes to the judge. She's been preyed upon by someone. She has, notice the language that she uses here, avenge me of mine enemy. So she has an enemy, and all she has is a request, avenge me. So she comes before the judge. All we know of her is she's a widow. She's most likely elderly. She's alone. She has no power in her own hand to take care of this. No one else is going to take up for her. Probably means she doesn't have any children. And she comes to the judge and she has this request, avenge me of mine enemy. So she has an enemy and she has a request. She has a condition that should evoke a response of compassion, but it doesn't, because she's standing before the judge who doesn't fear God or regard man. This widow is you and me. This widow is us. Do you know you have an enemy? You have an enemy, and he wants to destroy you. He wants to take away from you everything that makes you, you. He wants to take away from you the possibility of you receiving God's best for your life. He wants to destroy you. He wants to corrupt you. We have an enemy just like this poor widow. So we have that in a city, an unjust judge and a widow with a request. Now, notice the unjust reason. Verse 4. And he would not for a while. That's how verse 4 begins. Isn't that an odd way for the sentence to begin? But notice verse 3, that phrase there, the widow came to him and said, avenge me of mine adversary. And the very first thing in verse 4 is, he would not for a while. I mean, and what else would we expect from an unjust judge, right? He's not going to do it because he doesn't care about this woman. She's a widow. She has an enemy. She wants to be avenged of her enemy. She's right, but guess what the judge is? The judge is the right. He thinks of himself as right. Because he doesn't fear God, he doesn't regard men. You know what that means about the judge? It means that he himself, all alone, is the single authority of truth and justice. In a way, he thinks of himself as God. His position has corrupted his mind to the point that he doesn't fear God or regard man because he is the standard of right and wrong. And this widow comes in and says, avenge me. He says, I don't want to avenge you. This is not worthy of my time or attention. Get out of my courtroom. So he wouldn't. But guess what the widow does? Look at the next thing in verse 5. Yet because this widow troubleth me. So what's the widow doing? She's coming back to his courtroom. And she's saying to him, Avenge me of my enemy. That's all we know that she says. Avenge me of my enemy. I have an enemy. He's hurt me. I need you, judge, to take care of this.